My name is Amir Barber. I'm a chemical engineer and a fitness educator. And today I'm sharing all my secrets about the triceps in this triceps masterclass. Okay, but why should you even care? Why, especially enough to sit through a masterclass? Well, this fun fact might pique your interest. If I were to take your arm and just cut it off right here, lop it clean off, I grab it out of the screen and I show it to you this way, over 75% of this cross-sectional area is triceps. So if you want big arms, big triceps are a necessity, which is why you're watching this video and why you clicked on it, okay? So brief overview, we're gonna be talking some theory in the beginning, some anatomy, the functions of the triceps. We'll be debunking some common myths along the way, and then we'll talk about how to actually train them and avoid injury while doing so. And then at the end of the video, I'll give you the 3 exercises you can use to maximize growth and have a well-rounded stimulus to the triceps. So without further ado, let's jump right in. First order of business, anatomy. Okay, so the triceps are made up of 3 muscles, which is why they're called the triceps. All right, the first guy we'll talk about is the long head right here. And then right next to it, actually lateral to it, we have the lateral head of the triceps. And then if we were to peel both of these back, then we would be able to see the medial head of the triceps. Now, all 3 heads of the triceps share basically the same insertion point on the ulna down here, so on this forearm bone. And just a brief side note on how muscles work, they create bone-to-bone pull. So let's say the lateral head originates from your upper arm bone, your humerus. When it contracts, it wants to pull these 2 points closer together, right? So this would be further apart, this would be closer together, all right? And that's why it's important to have a working knowledge of their origins and insertions. So the lateral head, like we discussed, inserts at the upper arm bone, and so does the medial head, a little bit lower on the upper arm bone, but all they care about is elbow extension, and that's all those 2 are good for. All right, but the long head is a little bit of a weird case because as you can see, it actually comes up, crosses over the shoulder joint and attaches to the scapula. So now all of a sudden when we raise our arm, something's going on with the triceps. This would be a stretched one, this would be a contracted one. So because of this relationship between its origin and insertion, because it's biarticular, it can assist in elbow extension, but it also has a very weak shoulder extension function, okay? Now, for all intents and purposes, you're not going to grow your triceps by doing shoulder extension because you have other prime movers that are much better suited for the job, like your lats and rear delts and things of that nature. But it's important to keep in mind that it is a weak shoulder extensor, and we will talk about why later, okay? But there are 2 main ways that we're going to grow our triceps and will give a stimulus to our triceps. So there's pressing, which is a multi-joint movement because both our elbows and our shoulder joints are moving at the same time. And then there's pure elbow extension, in which our upper arm stays still and all we're doing is elbow extension. So let's ignore pressing for a second and just talk about pure elbow extension. Okay, like we said, only our elbow joint is moving. However, our upper arm can take on different positions. So we can have our arm down by our side, like right here. We can have it out in front of us, like right here, or we can have it slightly above that, or we can even have it overhead. But again, it's staying still, and all that should be moving is the elbow joint. All right, so this will target all 3 heads of the triceps. However, based on where you place your upper arm, you will emphasize a different portion of the triceps. All right, and that's why we have science, baby. So this study kind of mapped out the force productions of each of the heads of the triceps at different degrees of shoulder elevation. Okay, so on the x-axis right here, we have degrees of shoulder elevation, and this skeleton dude corresponds with these varying locations. So over here, 180 degrees is the arm overhead. And then as we make our way over here, this is where our arms are down by our sides. Now there are 3 different lines on this graph that correspond to the 3 different heads of the triceps. In red, we have the long head. In green, we have the lateral head. And in blue, we have the medial head. Okay? So when we're doing pure elbow extension with our arms down by our sides, our long head is actually capable of so much force relative to the medial and the lateral head. Okay, and as we raise our arm, so at 90 degrees, you'll see that we hit this point right here where the medial head is on the come up and has a lot of force production, and the lateral head almost peaks out as well right there. And the long head is still contributing, obviously. It's just less than it was when your arms were down by your side. And as we continue raising our arms overhead, the force production of all of them decrease slightly. Okay, so the takeaway here is this is more long head, and as we raise our arms, this is going to be more medial and lateral head. And before someone goes in the comments and says, well, there's this one study that shows that the long head grows better overhead, that was just one study, and from my perspective, it was fairly poorly done, and we have several other studies that all line up really well. So it would take several other studies showing something different for me to change my mind, and it also just makes sense from a biomechanics standpoint. I digress. Let's talk about pressing now. So pressing is a combination of shoulder flexion and elbow extension, okay? And it's very clear to see in a dumbbell press. Our shoulder is flexing and our elbow's extending. Bent elbow, straight elbow, okay? Now, any pressing motion is going to be almost entirely lateral and medial heads of the triceps. Those are the two heads of the triceps that are going to assist. And the long head is not going to be worked well at all. So if you remember earlier when I said, keep in mind that the triceps long head is a weak shoulder extensor, okay? This was the reason why. Because in a pressing motion, if we're telling our central nervous system and our brain, hey, we want to do shoulder flexion, okay? It's not going to go ahead and turn on the long head because that's counterproductive to the movement pattern, right? If we want to do shoulder flexion and if we contracted the long head, it would actually want to pull our arms down, then there's no reason for our body to turn it on. And that is something called antagonist inhibition, okay? Which your CNS is actually going to decrease recruitment and activation of the triceps long head because it is an antagonist in that movement. It would be counterproductive to turn it on, okay? So for any pressing motion in which your shoulder joint and your elbow joint is moving at the same time, the medial head and the lateral head of the triceps are going to be the ones working. All right, so just a high-level overview takeaway. If you want to hit the long head of your triceps, okay, you're going to want to do pure elbow extension with your arms down by your side. Something like this guy right here. Okay, let me turn the marker on. Something like this guy right here. Okay, and if you want to bias the medial lateral head, you have a couple of options. You can either do pure elbow extension with your shoulder elevated at 90 degrees or more. I think 90 degrees is a great sweet spot. So like I am right here, that is 90 degrees. Or you could do any type of pressing, right? So if you're doing a bench press, that's going to be a lot of chest, front delt. But if you wanted to do something more geared towards the triceps, you could do something like a close grip bench press or a JM press. However, any pressing motion is going to give some sort of stimulus to the medial and the lateral heads of the triceps. Okay? But now we can get into actual training. All right, so there's three things that go into exercise selection, or three main things that I'll be considering in this video. There's gonna be alignment, which is super important. We're gonna talk a little bit about range of motion. And then lastly, we'll talk about resistance profiles. And all three of these are very important to keep in mind as we're picking out exercises. First, we're gonna tackle alignment. So in any movement pattern, alignment is very important, specifically alignment between the resistance and the joint that you're trying to influence, because all muscles do is manage torque at given joints. So muscles act on joints. So you want to make sure the resistance is aligned with the proper joint so that we can deliver the resistance to the muscle. Okay? And there's also a lot of implications to that. So first of all, we want to deliver the load to the muscle, but second of all, if it's misaligned with the joints, we can be placing a lot of unnecessary tension and load on our connective tissues, which is what we're going to talk about because healthy elbows are so important for long-term gains. So what can we actually do to ensure proper alignment in the context of elbows and triceps? Okay. Now, when it comes to any pressing motion or pure elbow extension, so in both cases, all right, we want our lower arm to fold up directly over our upper arm. This is the only way that the elbow joint wants to move. It's a hinge joint. So we don't want the resistance pulling us this way. So if the cable were like going that way, or a dumbbell were pushing us this way, we don't want anything pulling us this way or this way. We want it to be straight in line, and we want it to just fold up and down just like that. Okay. And then when it comes to pure elbow extension, we also want, it's very important that the line of force supplied by the resistance, right? So in the case of a dumbbell, that points, or any free weight, that points straight down all the time because of gravity. In a cable, it's literally just the direction of the cable, but we want to line that up perfectly with the elbow joint. So now we'll walk through some examples of poor alignment so you could see what I'm talking about, okay? So right here on the left, you can see I have this high degree of elbow flare. Okay, so my elbows are out to the side like this, all right? And the line of force, right, is, now this isn't perfect because we're kind of off at an angle, but the line of force, or the lines of force, are pretty much straight up and down here, okay? So you can see that there is a misalignment between the line of force and the elbow joint. So what that means is that there is some component of that force that is actually pulling my elbows this way. All right? And just to drive this home, okay? Your elbow's a hinge joint. Just like this tripod, it's a hinge joint. This is the only direction it wants to move in, okay? So if over time we keep applying a force sideways to this, a component of the force sideways to this poor thing is gonna break, all right? And your triceps may not, or your elbows may not break, but they definitely will ache over time, all right? So yeah, this is a longevity thing. Are your elbows gonna explode the first time you do this? No, but if you do it for 5, 10 years at a time, you're probably gonna run into some issues, or at least you're at a higher risk of running into some issues, okay? So try tucking your arms closer in as we did in this second example, which again, this isn't perfect alignment, but it's a lot closer, right? So this line of force is a lot closer to this joint. We would ideally like it going right through. So this grip actually is limiting for my specific set of anatomy, basically. Now, if your shoulder width is just perfectly in line there and the lines of force go right through your elbow joint, have at it. But for a lot of people, these fixed grips don't work very well. And we'll walk through another fixed grip, right, in the skull crushers. Okay, so here's an example of easy bar skull crushers. And again, the line of force is just gonna point straight down here on, I'll just do the left side, okay? But we can see that, first of all, like we said, our upper arm is not folding up straight over our lower arm, or our lower arm's not folding up straight over. It's actually at kind of an angle here. So there's something pulling our elbow this way. Okay, so the line of force is not aligned with this joint. Okay, and then similarly out here, right? Now the difference is I grabbed it in a different location, I think. Yes, okay. But still I have a high degree of elbow flare. So there is misalignment, and that's not gonna be very good on the joints. So if you wanted to make this movement work, what you can do over here, okay, so this is me, I'm actually fighting my elbows in for all I'm worth over here, and there's still this misalignment. We can see that, right? But over here on the right, well, my hands are kind of in line with my shoulder joint, so I could really fight my elbows in, get them perpendicular to the ground, right? So my upper arm would be running perpendicular to the ground, and then the line of force would be mostly, probably like right about here. It'd be mostly aligned in this case. Okay, so that's something that we can do to combat that, is fight the elbows in, But again, you have to be very vigilant when you're doing these exercises because your elbows are gonna wanna flare out, especially depending on your structure. If you're a bigger person, they're gonna wanna flare out. But that's generally why I don't recommend fixed grips for most people, right? So your hands are stuck in place because it tends to lead to poor alignment, especially based on most people's structures, right? Like for an easy bar, there's 2 spots to grab it. You can grab it here or you can grab it here. If you go any wider, that's just gonna be even worse, right? So unless your structure perfectly lines up with that, which it kind of doesn't for most people, or for a lot of people at least, then I would stay away. Okay, and even if you're like, Amir, why don't I just use a straight bar when I'm doing these? Valid question, okay? Now the problem with the straight bar is it alleviates the problem of there's only 2 grips to choose from because you can slide your hands to wherever you want, okay? But the problem is you're in full pronation, right? So put your arm down by your side, right? Take a neutral grip. Right here, our arms folded up just how we want it. Now try going into full pronation. It's difficult to get into full pronation without your upper arm moving. So you saw my upper arm kind of having to move if I'm in full pronation. Okay, so that's why straight bars can be bad for a lot of people. Now, if you have that mobility and you're just totally fine being there, by all means, go for it. But that's generally why I don't recommend it for most people. Okay, now I talked a lot about problems, but this video should be about solutions. So I do have solutions for you, okay? So we're gonna talk about an exercise that has beautiful alignment, okay? This is the single arm cuffed triceps extension, okay? So a couple things to note. We're in a neutral grip, so we don't run into that pronation problem. So we're right here, which is great. But then also, this is a perfect example of the line of force running right through that elbow joint. Okay, so the line of force is the cable, okay? And it's running right through that elbow joint. Now, it's not directly straight on this angle of the camera, but it is running through the elbow joint still. If I got the perfect angle, you'd see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, and that is exactly what we're going for. We want that line of force to travel directly through the elbow joint. Okay, so just perfect alignment on this one. And yeah, that's all there is to be said about this one. You can see throughout the full range of motion, take a look at the cable, the line of force is always going straight through that elbow joint. Just absolute beauty, okay? And it's even better down here. Look at that. I bisected my arm with it, okay? So that's an example of great alignment. Now we'll move on to range of motion considerations. Quick reminder, if you like the video, please like the video. Comment, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff to help the algorithm so I can keep making this stuff. Thank you. This slide can be a whole video in and of itself that's probably longer than this video, okay? But I'm gonna try keeping it brief because we wanna focus on the triceps and how to grow them, okay? So, you've probably heard a blanket statement online at some point saying the stretch is the most important part of the rep, right? Just a blanket statement across all muscles. And that is true for some muscles, but not for the triceps. Let's say it's true for the quads, right? Not true for the triceps. So this is the length to tension relationship. I don't even know why I put it on here. I'm not gonna go too deep down the rabbit hole, but the triceps fall entirely on the plateau of the length to tension relationship. So its sarcomeres, no matter how much you actually lengthen the overall muscle, they never get to the point where they experience a lot of passive tension, okay? Which that over there is the driver for stretch-mediated adaptations or stretch-mediated hypertrophy. That's a mouthful. I'm gonna back off the microscopic stuff for a little bit, and we're just gonna talk about overall biomechanics. Okay, so if you're doing a triceps pushdown, and let's say you're challenging your triceps through the majority of the range of motion, you're using a load that's hard from here to here. If you come all the way up here and try folding up, your triceps do not have the leverage to actually complete the movement. So what your body is gonna do to try making it work, it's gonna tip your scapula over the top so you can try kind of pushing down. And that's not gonna be good for your shoulder joint, okay? So from both, when we get down to the sarcomere level and those considerations and the length tension relationship, doesn't seem to be a benefit from the stretch. And when you get into the biomechanics of it, it doesn't make much sense to go there either. So what I would say from my experience is that 0 to 120 degrees of elbow flexion is a safe bet. I mean, you're still getting a pretty good stimulus in the lengthened range. 120 degrees is about right here, okay? And you're training it through almost the full range of motion, but there's no need to go way deep into that stretch, okay? But I want to point out that partial ranges of motion are likely just fine. So if you just did your triceps extensions like this, probably just fine, okay? The only thing I would say is beware standardizing form. Like let's say if you're choosing a partial range of motion like right here, just make sure throughout that full set that you keep that range of motion consistent. Like you shouldn't start your set doing this and then end your set doing this, right? Because then it makes it very hard to track progressive overload, and progressive overload is a really important thing to track. So that's what I would say, beware standardizing that range of motion. But the takeaway here is that they likely do not benefit from a deep stretch, contrary to what a lot of people will say. Okay, so that's all I'm gonna say about this range of motion considerations. Partial ranges of motion are likely just fine. If you wanna play it safe, go up to 120, okay? All right, the last thing we're gonna talk about before I get into the recommended exercises is resistance profiles. All right, so what is a resistance profile? At a high level, it explains where the exercise is most difficult and where it's easiest, all based on joint torque provided by the resistance. Okay, so in these two scenarios, the resistance profiles are different, and all I did was take a step back, okay? So if we kind of just draw these lines of force, okay, and draw them fairly poorly, all right? Wherever our forearm forms a 90-degree angle with the line of force throughout the range of motion means that that's where there is max joint torque. Okay, so on the left here, the resistance profile is maxed out here. So there's the most resistance and challenge here to the triceps. And in this guy over here, there's the most challenge to the triceps down here. Okay, and I failed to mention this earlier because I think it fit better into this section, but based on how you alter the resistance profile, whether you emphasize and challenge to the max down here or up here, it can change which heads of the triceps are biased. Now, exactly which heads of the triceps are biased is a little bit of guesswork right now. Okay, because we have some conflicting studies looking at different leverages throughout the different ranges of motion, and the data is fairly unclear. However, what seems to be clear is that there is a difference between the three heads of the triceps in their leverages based on where we are in elbow flexion or extension. So, safe bet is to include different resistance profiles throughout your training career, right? So, I'm not saying go and do 5 different variations where you take a little bit of a step back every time in your current plan. I'm just saying if you've been doing this guy for several months, okay, maybe on your next cycle you do this guy for a little bit. Or on a different day you change up the resistance profile a little bit. But it's just something to keep in mind. So if you're working with a cable, it is where there is a 90-degree angle between your forearm and the direction from the cable. Okay, that's where there's peak torque. That's what you're gonna emphasize with that movement, okay? And there are other ways to change the resistance profile as well. So for example, using bands. So bands, the challenge increases as the band gets stretched out, right? So it's harder in the bottom, which means you're challenging the triceps more in this range of motion than up here. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind with the bands. Let's do a little video of me using the bands. Nice. So it gets harder as the band gets stretched out more. That's just how elastics work. Okay, the moment you've all been waiting for, my exercise recommendations, and what takes the cake at number 1, not that these are ranked in order, but first mention is the cupped single arm triceps extension. Okay, for a few different reasons. First of all, as we mentioned earlier, this thing has just beautiful alignment with the elbow joint, super gentle on the joint itself, delivers all that resistance straight to the triceps. Absolutely love it. Okay, it's also pretty stable too. So you can use your other hand, your non-working hand, to grab onto that pole for support, and it just makes the overall environment more stable, which helps with output from the target musculature. Okay, and then another thing that you can do with this one, because if you took a step back, you wouldn't really be able to hold on to that pull, right? So another way to alter the resistance profile of this movement is just by changing the pulley. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys this line of force, right? So the resistance is peaked out at 90 degrees of elbow flexion or extension, I guess, okay? And then as we put the pulley down, let's say right here, now there's peak torque here, okay? So now we're challenging down here more, and if we put it down further, then we'd be challenging full extension, okay? So it's a very versatile movement, and over time you can include different variations, different resistance profiles, things like that. And then the last thing I'll mention with this movement is the use of the cuffs. Total game changer, okay? So using the cuffs, what it does is it reduces the demand of the forearm musculature to get involved with the movement, which means more output from the triceps, okay? So it ensures that the point of failure, the weakest link that actually causes failure, is not your grip strength and not your forearms, it's actually your triceps, okay? And before people have a habit of going like, well, just train your forearms. I do, separately, okay? So this is a great movement for the triceps, so I'm gonna try making it the most useful for the triceps, okay? So go ahead, try it out for yourself. What you'll find is that by using the cuff, you may be able to eke out an extra 1 or 2 reps on your sets. And you may be like, okay, a rep, 2 reps? But when taken in the context and you consider the fact that the last 4 to 6 reps of any set taken to failure are the ones that are responsible for stimulating growth, especially in the intermediate to advanced population of trainees, 1 to 2 reps makes all the difference, okay? So go ahead, try them out. Feels great on the wrists too. And yeah, this is gonna be, by the way, great for the long head, okay? Because your arm's down by your side in this variation, okay? 2, I said 1.5 basically, because it's the same exact movement, it's just you're crossing the cables and you're using cuffs as well. So what this allows for, again, if you set it up right, great alignment with the elbow joint. It's just a more efficient choice, right? Like if you don't have time to do a bunch of single arm stuff, this is a great alternative. I love it. And yeah, we'll move on to 2 now. 2 is the banded JM press, all right? This is gonna prioritize the medial and the lateral heads of the triceps, okay? So with the JM press, there's a few things special about this setup. First of all, it's on a Smith machine, which kind of allows you to rotate your hands in so that you can fold your upper arm right over your forearm, right? So instead of having, let's say if you're grabbing a barbell, you kind of have to be here, you can actually rotate in a little bit, do a suicide grip on the JM press on the Smith machine, and you'll be fine, and you'll get better alignment that way. And then the bands alter the resistance profile so it challenges the triceps appropriately throughout the range of motion, okay? Because at the bottom here, there's the most joint torque, right? And as you come up, there's less and less and less joint torque, and you have more of an appearance of strength, okay? So it gets harder as you're better able to handle the load. And what that makes for is grinder reps. So when you're just getting harder as you go up, and it's mostly tricep from here to here. So by challenging from here to here the most, you're getting a great stimulus to the triceps. Meanwhile, down here, there could be a lot of other things going on with the front delts and the chest and whatnot, but from here to here, it's mostly triceps, okay? So that's why we put the bands on, to make it harder, where it's mostly triceps and also where we can handle the most load, okay? So I have a tutorial on these, I'll link it down below, but these are absolutely killer. It just takes a little bit of playing around to find proper alignment, because if your grip is kind of set wrong, then you will have this whole elbow bendy thing this way, and we don't want none of that. We want to line up directly over our upper arms. Last but most definitely not least is the elevated triceps extension. So we are going to elevate our upper arm to about 90 degrees and just do this, okay? So we are actually going to put our back to this pole if possible to anchor for stability. But my favorite variation, and I like this actually way more than single arm, is doing them both at the same time with a bench. Now, the reason I didn't put this one as primary or first is just because it takes a lot of setup. Like, you have to get the bench in exactly the right spot. You have to find a bench that, you know, the cables don't bump into, things like that. But if you can get a proper setup for this variation, so much better, okay? In my opinion, at least. So again, you're getting great alignment. Like, you can see that the cable would probably want to travel this way. Like, if my arm's in the way, but that's good because that means it's right in line with my arm. And yeah, overall feels awesome, okay? And again, you can alter the resistance profile of this movement by changing the pulley height. So the further up you put it, the more you're gonna challenge the end position there, okay? And that is all when it comes to recommending exercises. And another important thing to keep in mind is that your triceps, specifically the medial and the lateral head, are going to pick up a stimulus from doing your normal pressing movements. So when you're doing chest or when you're doing shoulders, you are going to be picking up a lot of lateral and medial head stimulus, which is generally why I say if you were to only prioritize one of these movements, it would be the triceps extension with your arm down by your side. Okay, and again, I didn't include this on the list. I think that banded variation I showed you guys was sweet for challenging this range of motion, and then the cable is definitely better for challenging up here, okay? But at the end of the day, these are my recommendations based on all the factors I laid out. They are not must-dos. There are a lot of other ways you can get creative with it, but I think that this is a great starting point for most people. And all of the movements I mentioned, 1, 2, and 3, they did something slightly different, right? So they weren't redundant movement patterns, right? The first one, our arm was down by our side, more long head. This one, our arm was elevated, more medial and lateral head. And the third one was a compound movement, right? Because our shoulders and our elbows are moving, the JM press, for the triceps. So overall, I think by sticking with these 3 variations, you can have a very well-rounded stimulus to the triceps and grow a massive set of them. If you liked the video, please like the video, subscribe, and thank you for watching.